Hello, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Karcher. I'm the Executive Director at the Woodrow Wilson House here in Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful day. We have a wonderful discussion ahead of us. Before we get started on that, I would like to just give an update on some events that are taking place at the Wilson House. Thank you to all of you who are tuning in today for our continuation of our Lunch and Learn speaker series. It is quite successful. We've got people tuning in every single week, which has been a tremendous commitment for my staff, as well as for the speakers to be tuning in and getting ready and preparing for these discussions. We need to suspend next week's discussion. There has been a delay for that speaker, but the series will continue the following week. I'll give you an update at the end of our discussion today on all of the future speakers that are coming. But I do want to say thank you to those of you who are tuning in. These are all free. If you'd like to make a contribution, of course, it goes to the Woodrow Wilson House, and we thank you for any support you can give the house. What's happening in our garden? Our Victory Garden is still growing and still beautiful in front of the house. It was our inspiration for the Suffrage Outside exhibition in the rear garden. The Suffrage Outside exhibition has been tremendous and very well received. And I thank those of you who've come out. I thank those of you who've sent your friends. We have some people who've written about it in the press and have come to visit. It really is quite something to see. We're looking at suffrage outside and using the suffragists. They were outside, rain, shine, sleet, or snow, and so people are coming, rain or shine. We are open to have people come see the exhibition. It is in the garden. You need to make a reservation in advance. You'll wear your mask. There are hand sanitizers there, but it all is socially distant, but it is intended to be outside and something to do outside with the family. So please make your reservation. It too is free. So if you'd like to make a donation, pay what you will, pay what you wish, but come and see the exhibition. We also have outside, we've started our walking tours, which with today's weather, which is a 10 out of 10 here in Washington, D.C., people are taking walking tours that have been curated by the Woodrow Wilson House. We have the Watty Butler Wood tour, which is called If These Walls Could Talk. It's about the houses that Watty Butler Wood, the architect of the Woodrow Wilson House, built, and the people who lived, the historic figures that lived in these houses. We also have what we call the audio walking tour of Kalorama. So you can tune in and listen to a tour. We have ambassadors and residents of historic buildings in the Kalorama neighborhood, Embassy Row, talking about the historic buildings that line and are around the neighborhood of the Woodrow Wilson House. We have over 1,000 reservations have come through on our system since we started it for either our walking tours, our speaker series, or for the suffrage outside. That's really exciting for us that we're able to share the things that we're doing, and people are listening and paying attention and coming. So with that, we have one more announcement, and that is tomorrow night. For those of you who've been around the Wilson House for a while, you know that on the first Wednesday of every month, we had vintage game night. And people would come. It would be a social happy hour for people in the Washington, D.C. neighborhood to come and have a drink and play a vintage game. We needed to suspend that during COVID. We did a few online, a few virtual vintage games. Of course, virtual and vintage don't really go hand in hand, but we decided we would do a vintage game night live in our garden. And it is tomorrow night. It is the first Wednesday of October. It is actually, you'll be able to see the Suffrage Outside exhibit outside playing vintage games. We'll have croquet and bocce and ring toss that we provide for our visitors. And if you'd like to play your board games, that those of you who come traditionally for our vintage game night, bring your own board games. We'll have tables and chairs set up. We'll have some beverages available. And we encourage you to come and enjoy our vintage game night live outside tomorrow night. The weather, today's 10 out of 10, tomorrow is supposed to be 11 out of 10. So please consider coming. It's from 5:30 to 7 p.m. Tomorrow. It will be one of the few times that you'll be able to see suffrage outside at dusk. And I encourage you to come and see that, because it really is quite something. So let's get ready and talk about today's event. Today's part 2 about a talk that we had on July 14th, actually. Brenda Jones is the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. She will be moderating today, and we have Professor S Yellin from the University of Richmond. He wrote a book that we carry in our bookstore, Racism in the Nation's Service. We sell this in our bookstore. I thank you, Professor Yellin, for joining us today. I thank both of you this is part 2. Part 1 was so engaging, and so let's get right to part 2. So with that, I turn it over to you.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you for having us back. It was a delight and a pleasure to talk to Eric earlier. And I was so fascinated by the events that you are mentioning at the Wilson House. I may have to come over and get involved myself. They really, especially Suffrage After Dark and all of those, they are some fantastic events. So congratulations on engaging the public in such a profound way, especially during a very difficult time in our history. So, Professor Yellin, why don't you tell us firstly a little bit about your book, Racism in Government Service, just so we know where you're coming from and we can sort of catch everybody up to what we were talking about.
Yeah, we had a really great conversation about how do we contextualize Woodrow Wilson's impact on government, and in particular in questions of race and racism. And my book is about African-American civil servants. That's its sort of core story, who arrived in fairly large numbers in the late 19th century, and through a combination of skill, talent, educational opportunities, and politics, particularly Republican politics, managed to institutionalize a world of Black work in the federal government that was both financially remunerative. These were good jobs, well-paying jobs, decent-paying jobs, politically connected, connected to the sort of the remnants of the Republican Party's commitment to African Americans after emancipation, and even into the era of disenfranchisement, as African Americans lost the right to vote. Republican Party operatives still had some connection to Black politicians, and that connection was most visible in Washington, where African Americans could pull political strings, use their educations and their skills to not only get decent government jobs, but move up and wind up in supervisory positions, and also get presidential appointments. And so that world of sort of labor and national service was a world that Wilson entered into when he arrived in Washington, when he became president in March 1913. He was elected in 1912. And when he arrived in March 1913, he brought with him a coterie of white Southern Democrats whose political world were not only based in a different political view from Republicans, but certainly a very different racial politics, of politics that was designed to remove African Americans from equal citizenship in the United States. And they had done so quite successfully in Southern states, where many of them came from. And when they arrived in Washington, in some ways in 1913, they were a bit shocked to discover a world in which the city of DC was not legally segregated, and neither were federal offices. And so African Americans working and moving wherever they like, but they were also in charge in areas and sort of symbols of Black power that really threatened members of Wilson's administration and Wilson himself. And so the book tracks the kind of that rise of those group of workers, and then what happened when segregation was laced and threaded into the federal government by Wilson's administration, and the ways in which that not only was humiliating and painful, but was deeply costly financially and to the Washington's Black community as a whole. And what you see is quite literally decline in land ownership, and the decline in wages, and families really suffering as those opportunities in the kind of company town, right, the primary avenue for decent employment, was cut off in the 19 teens during the Wilson administration.
Well, what's interesting too, as a native Washingtonian, I was born in Washington, D.C., and I think this is something we mentioned last time, the relationship of African Americans to the federal government and to government service as a means to elevate a community and stabilize it was really a Washington that I was born into. And I think people coming here don't realize the legacy of African Americans really began over 100 years ago in this city, and the process of gentrification and other things that has sort of wiped out some of that history, legacy, or relationship to the city is a very old history. It's not just recent American history, but it relates to a legacy that was started after Reconstruction. Anyway, one of the things that we were trying to do in our last discussion was to use Wilson and his story as a way to explore who we are now, because some of these issues that that Wilson dealt with and that are part of his presidency are actually recapitulations of what we are experiencing right now in American history. So one of the things that we mentioned is his campaign. I was thinking, since we are in a campaign season, it might be meaningful and interesting to look at Wilson's presidential campaigns and to see how some of these same issues sort of played out in his time. And the great thing about history is it's a safe space. You can look at it, you know what happened. There's nothing to fear or be concerned about. It's not your present reality. You can see some of the same energies and ideas that sort of played out and what happened and what the influences were. One of the fascinating things to me about Woodrow Wilson as a backdrop is that his grandparents were actually abolitionists. But his experiences living in the South during the Civil War as a little boy sort of entrenched him in the kind of segregation and racism that we associate with, the South, especially during Civil War period. So that is interesting to me, the way that these issues of self-interest can alter the way that we view something that actually may have a moral component. So abolition, much of abolition was based on the idea that this is just patently wrong, regardless of what you may feel about equality. There was this sense that it was just not. We had to get out of the moral degradation that was involved in engaging in it. But because Wilson lived in the South, those influences dissipated. And when his self-interest or his experience with some of these issues became more personal, then he became a staunch segregationist. So maybe you might want to comment on that.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one of the things always fascinating about Wilson is that his mother was actually an immigrant and his father was from the Midwest, right? He didn't come from a family, as he said, rooted in the white South. But his father was a Presbyterian minister who got involved in a world of Presbyterianism and elite white society, initially in Virginia, very briefly in Virginia, and then ultimately in Georgia and South Carolina, that had enormous stake in first slavery, right? So Wilson's father, by all accounts, was in favor of secession and in favor of preserving the institution of slavery, of continuing to enslave African Americans. Wilson himself would say later that that he thought that emancipation and abolition of slavery was right. He would say that unequivocally. That wasn't the same as saying that people of African descent were equal. That's not what he said, right? But it's Wilson's father in Columbia, South Carolina, and in Georgia, where it becomes deeply entrenched in a white Southern vision of who's eligible for participation in civic life, right? And that Wilson grew up in, a world in which Black people were not eligible for full participation in civic life, and that I think is and not only were Black people not eligible, but when they did find space, when they, for example, during Reconstruction, the world that the Wilsons were in saw this as tragic, saw this as a profound loss of white power, and which they often described as a loss of honor and sort of decency in American democracy. When African Americans during Reconstruction got political power, the Wilsons were living in South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina, and white leaders in Columbia, South Carolina were furious at the sort of the way that African Americans voted in their numbers, right? That South Carolina, we know that that Black population in the United States in American history wavers between 10 and 12%. But when you go to places like South Carolina or Mississippi, you can get majority Black counties, majority Black towns. You can get 30, 40% African Americans. And when those folks were allowed to vote during Reconstruction, they had political power that was equal to their numbers. And white South Carolinians were horrified by that. And that's a kind of crucible of Wilson's worldview, right? As his parents struggled to figure out how to get back power that they had entitled to. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that is interesting to me in that whole dynamic is the issue of self-interest. I think often some of these ideas that we have about equality and morality sometimes emerge actually at their root from economic power and the ideas of self-interest. So, when you look at the history of racism, a lot of it is tied to the need to elevate, the need firstly to deal with the issue you brought up, that slavery, just due to its nature, because it was an agricultural activity, engaged thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who had to be disenfranchised. Otherwise, if you had, say, one man, one vote, their votes would have outnumbered the people who were the owners. And so a lot of the ideas that we accept as part of our reality, as sort of the ground floor foundation for who we are in American democracy, do not actually emerge from a moral basis. We know they're not scientific. They come from this economic notion that if I am to retain the power that I want, then I cannot engage in a full democratic process. Because if I do that, I may be disenfranchising myself.
Yeah, and the way that can get supported by structures like that seem race neutral, like individualism or property ownership, right? That most people agree that the law should protect property ownership. What if we develop those laws in a system in which we have systematically excluded people from being able to own property, or in which we have labeled those people to be property, right? Then the protection of a seemingly benign notion of people should be able to hold on to their stuff, right, takes on a consequence that is rooted, as you say, in a moral failing, right? This is the great insight of the scholar Ibram Kendi's work, right? To show the way in which racism is rooted in the needs and claims of powerful people.
Exactly. And then we as everyday people are engaged in, whipped up and engaged in these notions, so that when we go out to vote or we make decisions, we're making decisions based on a sort of emotionalism and not a rationality that is really, you know, when you're talking about especially choosing an executive, you know, like the president, for example. The executive branch is a branch of government that makes decisions on behalf of people. And so really what you need, just as, you know, when you're choosing any executive, you need somebody who can make good, sound decisions. But actually the politics in America has been, you know, has been distorted by this connection to a kind of emotionalism that actually serves individuals who want to stay in power and may not always serve the people themselves who are engaged in this emotional thinking. So it is very important to recognize that some of these ideas emerge from a desire to retain economic power, as opposed to a basis in anything like reality. So tell us about Wilson's campaign, his 1912 campaign. What was he up against running for president?
Yeah, what's so remarkable about that campaign, and what's so interesting about Wilson particularly, as we try to reckon with his legacy and the consequences, good and bad, of his presidency, is to recognize that the campaign and the election that he ran in was essentially rooted in a progressive vision, right? A vision and an argument over what the outcomes of a progressive vision would be. Really, four candidates. People always forget about two of them. We usually think about Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson running, and those were the two leading vote getters. But there was also William Howard Taft, who was actually the incumbent and the Republican candidate, and Debs, the socialist, right? And so three of the four would have considered themselves out and out progressives. Taft tried to hold on to that mantle to some extent. It was a mantle he claimed in 1908 for sure. So you essentially have four candidates who position themselves as progressive, but then that raises the question of what did progressive mean, right? And so in a simple sense, it meant all four candidates argued that the government had a role to play to make people's lives better, right? That as opposed to a vision of fate is fate, and what happens to you is either some mix of fate, the will of God, or your own personal grit. Maybe the federal government, the national government, has a role to play in easing the route to opportunity and to creating opportunity. Then the details get complicated, right? Who should be responsible for that? Whose power should be balanced out by other demands and other claims? So what drove Wilson and Roosevelt and Debs is not that different from what's driving a lot of progressive visions right now, which is concern about the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of power among a few companies and a few people, right? They were responding to what we know as the Gilded Age, right? An era in which a few corporations, a few individuals had an enormous amount of power in the economy and simply an enormous amount of wealth. For both Wilson and Roosevelt, and certainly for Debs, that was the issue, right? And so how do you manage that? How do you both endorse entrepreneurship, right? And an economy in which people can take risk and invest and be creative, while at the same time ensuring that you don't over-accumulate and write people out of opportunity.
So
for Roosevelt, yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you this question. How could a man who is a segregationist, and I'm saying this from the standpoint of American politics today, be viewed or even see himself as progressive? How does that happen, and what is the difference between?
It's such a critical question. Yeah, it's a
Yes.
great question. And some of it, understand again, to be progressive. So progressive tends to be change what is now, right? And so in the case that we're talking about, use the federal government to make things better than they are now, right? So that that can mean all kinds of things, but in questions of race, right, what that meant was a certain amount of order. And this has to do with how we tell the story of the late 19th century, right? We tell a story of Reconstruction. Hopefully people now tell a story of Reconstruction in which African Americans were allowed to play a role in a truly open democracy. And then we're shut out by white Southerners who, both through violence and law, wrote African Americans out of full citizenship. And then we tend to imagine that emerging immediately from that was Jim Crow segregation, a system of order in which everybody knew their place. Black people were written out of both the voting and public accommodations and utterly separated. And that's not true. The story between the 1870s and the 1890s is a story of chaos. It's a story of violence. It's a story of real change across the country, but particularly in states in the former Confederacy. So what it meant to be progressive at the turn of the 20th century was to try to impose some kind of order on that system, on a system in which vigilante violence led to a spike in lynchings in the 1890s. It's almost every other day a Black person was lynched in the South. Right? That was violent, it was discordant, and for white progressives, some kind of order needed to be imposed. Order for those folks was segregation, was imposing separation and making clear the place of individuals, right, in society, so that Black people would know their place without having to resort to violence. White people would be assured of their authority and supremacy without having to resort to violence, right? And so for Wilson, segregationism is the alternative not to equality, but the alternative to what he saw as chaos, right? And
well, the other thing is, and we talked about this briefly at another point, is this whole understanding of who the people are in a democratic system. Wilson, you know, I certainly don't want to make your points, but I think that the way, what I heard from what you told me before is that Wilson was a Democrat, saw himself as a representative of the people and a progressive individual who wanted to make the lives of people better, but at the same time was also a rampant segregationist. Those two things can coexist in a vision of democracy that sees the people in a certain way. And that was one thing I really wanted you to share. How did Wilson view the statement, "We the people"?
We the people was you know, he thought of himself as a Democrat, and certainly in the Jacksonian mode, right? Of the people are ordinary, hardworking, local folks, right, who need to be enfranchised into a system that big money and elites had written them out of. Nowhere in that vision was there an inclusion of African Americans, right? So first, Black women were written out utterly because women were not allowed to vote, and Black women were frozen in a kind of mythic vision of subservience and the mammy image, right? For Wilson and most of his administration, their understanding of Black women was women who served in domestic roles, and that's it. That wasn't a role of civic involvement or citizenship or political equality. And then Black men were either a threat, people who did not understand that they were second class and needed to remain inferior, or simply didn't exist at all. And I think that there's a spectrum within the Wilson administration. I think for the most part, we can put Wilson in the camp of Black men did not exist as political subjects. They were disenfranchised in the South. They were not vital to his political career. They were not, as far as he was concerned, ready for full political citizenship. And so they could be essentially written out, all under the cover of universal claims about democracy that would, in theory, help everyone, right? This is what allowed Wilson to claim a mantle of universal democracy or universal progressivism, because he believed his theories would help everyone, including people who were not ready to participate fully, right? In a racist vision, that Black men were not ready to be participants. I think he, to some extent, thought that they would be helped, but they were not relevant to politics. They were not relevant to citizenship. There were others in his administration who were far more aggressive, people whose political lives, like Burleson from Texas, or Josephus Daniels from North Carolina, whose political lives were built not just on ignoring the claims of Black citizens, but in fact of actively suppressing and violently writing out Black people from US citizenship.
Well, the other thing is that when our democracy began, the idea of we the people was really circumscribed to a very small group of individuals, and it really has been struggle and activism that has expanded the democratic vision of this nation to something much broader than where it actually began.
And the need to expand that is what allowed somebody like Wilson to say that he was a small d Democrat, because he would have argued against the idea that the only people who mattered were, say, landowners, as in the founding era, right? Or elite men, as in the founding era. He embraced the changes of the 1820s and 1830s that expanded the franchise to people who were not necessarily elite. And that gave him a language of universal democracy. It just was so premised on a racial vision of who the people were that African Americans just simply did not count. Neither, for example, did Chinese Americans and Asian immigrants who were written out of US citizenship over the 19th century.
And this is why the activism of people, women, African Americans who opened up American democracy and said, these statements and ideas and principles should represent something much more profound, much greater, and actually exemplify what somebody like John Lewis would say, the divine spark in every human being that has a right to express itself, to manifest, to allow every individual to have a right to free choice and free, development of what they believe is right. So part of what we are experiencing now is this legacy of ideas that dates all the way back to Wilson and beyond. The idea of trickle-down economics is basically what you described. If you serve the wealthy, then ultimately all of the benefits will trickle down to other individuals, and people will, eventually get into better circumstances. Even though Wilson was somebody who probably would have argued against that notion. He probably would have felt that the government should engage, should be part of the lives of everyday Americans to help them elevate beyond, this trickle-down effect.
Yeah, Wilson would have asked a very good question, which is who gets to decide, right? Who gets to decide what will trickle down and who will be allowed to be recipients of what's trickling down, right? That was a question that progressives in his era were asking, and he certainly would have asked it.
So in every election, in many ways, we are sort of litigating democracy. We're litigating our definition of what we feel democracy is. And that's part of what we are experiencing now. We're trying to, we're being asked to make a decision to decide between two different visions of a democratic system. Do we believe in a system where government should be empowered to engage in people's lives? Or do we believe in a system that serves the rich in such a way that ultimately everybody else is benefited?
And I think one of the things that's so important about what you're saying is that this has always been debated, right? That this is not, that's right. what the outlines of democracy, who would be included and who would be excluded, it was not, there is no static version of democracy in American history. It always has been debated and always relied upon activism for folks to make as complete and inclusive as possible. That's always been a battle from the beginning.
And what Wilson allows us to see is the ways in which we, the people, are engaged in or engaged in ideas that shift, sometimes distort or affect our ability to make clear decisions about what democracy is. I mean, often in most elections, people are not, they don't perceive that what they are choosing is a certain kind of democratic system. They think they are making a choice between two individuals, you know, but actually it is a much greater choice that engages a lot of these conflicting notions. And that's what's powerful about Woodrow Wilson. He is somebody who, in some quarters, is considered a great president, you know, a diplomat, well-educated, you know, somebody who was engaged in creating the League of Nations, you know, powerful, profound vision of world unity and decision-making, but at the same time, simultaneously, was involved in some of the most damaging years of American democracy that engaged lynching, the rise of racism and Jim Crow, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Many of those things occurred, separationist and divisionist ideas that really ate away at the democratic nature of our society. And so how do these things coexist in the same sort of person inside Woodrow Wilson?
Some of it requires recognizing that he was a human being and human beings are flawed, but also recognizing that these are not sort of unfortunate sidelights or blind spots. That's sometimes one way we talk about flawed figures, is they were great. They just happened to have a blind spot. I don't think that works in this case. I think that part of what made some of Wilson's best moments were not only being blind to something, but premised on an exclusion or an ignorance, right? So some of his vision of the world, his hope for a kind of a League of Nations, or a world in which people had self-determination, was also profoundly representative of an American view that was ignorant about how the world actually worked, about what the world outside of the United States actually looked like, and who had power and who had a voice in that world. So it was very easy for Wilson to talk and develop soaring and meaningful rhetoric about democracy or self-determination without getting into a lot of very complex details about what people were actually experiencing in the world. And one of the reasons that Wilson really ran into some trouble in negotiations at the end of World War I and at Versailles was that he did not actually totally understand the world that he was talking about, right? And so I think he is us in some important ways, where we can hold on to some powerful universal visions of good visions, of moral visions. And if we don't really hear, if we don't really listen, and we don't really accrue knowledge and change our points of view, we can miss fact and we can miss experience, and then we can't help, right? We can't carry our vision forward.
And this is interesting for us to perceive today. So, for example, just the ideas of protest that we are experiencing, we are engaging today, the conflict that is involved in protest, the tension that is involved in protest. It challenges our notion that people have a right to speak up, to express themselves, sometimes very urgently, about ideas. It is not easy. It is not easy to say, easy for us to engage, but not always easy to live through and experience. If that protest is happening right outside your door, how do you feel about free speech then?
Right.
So I think some of the ideas that you describe you know, even in Wilson's failure as it relates to some of these soaring notions that he had, that are profound. Nonetheless, yes, when applied to human experience, requires sacrifice, discipline, and sometimes adjustment to the realities that people actually face.
And this is exactly what women suffragists who were protesting outside the White House every day said, right? How can you fight a war for democracy? And here we are saying that you're cutting out half of the human population from the vote, all women. How can you do both, President Wilson? And his argument was, again, to make a distinction between human rights and political rights, right? And ultimately it was untenable. And he actually had to change his mind, but it required a lot of protesting, right? A lot of attention getting and a lot of demands that were uncomfortable for him and for the country as a whole.
If I can jump in, we have a couple of questions. One of them actually is a statement, and as a question. So wasn't there also a problem of racial intolerance within the suffrage movement itself? So having done some research on our suffrage exhibition, that was one of the things we found, that this was not Wilson who, in fact, he felt that there was disenfranchisement of women across the board, regardless of race. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So this is changing a little bit, and I want to plug the work of Kathleen Cahill, who has a new book on women's suffrage that actually begins to write women of color back into the story of women's suffrage. But traditionally, the story of women's suffrage has put white women at the forefront. They certainly were, in many ways, the face of the women's suffrage movement. And so for Wilson, it was not a racialized issue. Again, it's another way in which Black women were utterly ignored. They were, in fact, there. They were in the 1912 suffrage parade. There were indigenous women. There were African-American women. Cahill shows that there were women who were representative of the U.S. population, of what Americans actually looked like. But the sort of iconic visions of women's suffrage were always white women at the front. And Wilson's objection to bringing women into the vote was a fear of what it would do to them as women, right? That women have particular roles, and that politics is a dirty business, a business that men ought to be engaged in, and women need to remain within their sphere so that they can be moral guardians, so that they can be mothers, so that they can be play their role in human society, and that was threatened if you enfranchise women, if they become political beings.
Yes. The other thing is that these are some of the same tensions we experience now in movements of today. You know, people, there's always this conversation about where Black women are as it relates to women's rights, because of some of the tensions that still exist inside.
The choices they had to make, right? Whose priorities, right?
These are choices women have to make, right? Families need to make right now during COVID. I mean, the number of women who are losing their jobs because they have to stay home to take care of their children, it's happening right today, where women are at an astronomical rate are losing their ability to stay employed. So, but that's, so can I get some other topics, some other questions? Is that?
Yes, please.
Sure. So one of them is about Ellen Axon Wilson, and there had been some criticism about her. This is Woodrow Wilson's first wife. She was First Lady from 1914 to 1915, and she worked on a project during her short period about the alleys and the alley dwellings and removing them. Now, some of the criticism is about her stance on race and her opinions, as she was from the South. Can you talk a little bit about Mrs. Wilson and her campaign? Even they said on her deathbed, one of her wishes was to outlaw the alley dwellings. Can we talk a little bit about that?
So you have to start with the strange landscape of Washington, D.C. urban planning, the way it was laid out by L'Enfant in the 18th century. And all those circles and strange diagonal lines create strange property lines, which included huge alleyways. And if you live in D.C., you know this, that there are these large alleyways behind, within that grid. Black people's primary role in Washington was to serve the white establishment and who were federal employees or federal government officials or business people. And African Americans were therefore needed to be close, right? And so one of the things that is fascinating about Washington, D.C. is that it was never quite as segregated as we might imagine, because those alleys created space for domestic workers to live behind the homes of white people in which they worked, right? And so because of low wages and domestic labor, because of entrenched and maintained poverty among African Americans in Washington, those alleys were also places in which people were poor, in which people were sick, in which people could not maintain the sanitary conditions that progressives like Ellen Wilson, like Woodrow Wilson, thought were important, were necessary for human life. And so Ellen Wilson got involved in a national campaign that we would recognize essentially as slum clearance, right? To remove poor people who don't live in conditions that that elites think are healthy, right? There's a sort of sanitary vision or medical vision. And so Wilson's impulse was essentially medical, right? Was about sanitizing Washington, D.C. to control outbreaks of typhoid or outbreaks of tuberculosis, and those which were often located in poorer neighborhoods, but not because there was something wrong with those people, but because they could not afford nutrition, because they could not afford medical care, because they were paid so poorly, because they were ignored by government. So was there a racial element to alley clearing? Absolutely. African Americans were disproportionately likely to be living in those alleys, and alley clearance in the progressive era did not come with a significant program for rehousing, right? For moving folks into houses that were healthy, that were made available at low cost, right? Low income housing or affordable housing, right? That was not a huge part of progressive era slum clearance. So what happened to these folks is they were moved out, right? Under a claim of sanitization, and then not given some place to live and not given wages to be able to afford to live in the sort of existing real estate market. I don't think that Wilson's impulse here was by definition racist, but there's plenty of rhetoric around slum clearance that imagined that people who lived in alleys were somehow different, were somehow, there's a sort of what we would recognize as a culture of poverty argument, right? There was something that had become wrong with people who lived with alleys, so lived in alleys. So removing them, those kinds of people, was good for the city as a whole. That was certainly inflected with what we would today recognize as a racial vision.
And then the other thing that this reminds us of is human unity. You know, the fact that if you don't allow people to develop, to engage in economic power and to take care of themselves in a capable way, it causes the degradation of the society of us all. You know, so here are these individuals who are left out, locked behind, you know, kept in a situation where they could not progress, and it caused an unsanitary, unhealthy circumstance for society at large. And instead of freeing them, allowing them to simply compete in the marketplace equally, what we've been doing is sort of moving people around, you know, clearing out the spaces where they congregate, but not giving them the right to simply engage in our economy freely without restriction.
Which gets at the question that Brenda asked about how do you have both a progressive and a racist vision at the same time. The progressive vision here was a recognition of interdependence, that if there are sick people in the community, everyone can be affected by that. That was a progressive vision. The racist vision was that certain people are more likely to get sick, are more likely to cause this problem, and they have to be removed.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Ellen or Woodrow or even his second wife Edith, do you think that they saw themselves as elites?
That's a great question. I think that Wilson certainly thought that he was in touch with folks who felt left out, right? So that the elites in this case were the governing class, Republicans, right? And they had, remember, Republicans won 10 out of 12 elections after the Civil War, right? So that the governing class, those who were really in charge, were politically different, were from a world that Wilson felt had been exclusive for sure. And so he certainly thought that he spoke for people who had been left out, Southerners, white Democrats. On the other hand, as the son of a leading Presbyterian minister, a graduate of Princeton and educated at the University of Virginia and Johns Hopkins, he certainly was plenty elite in his own way, and certainly Edith Bowling Galt Wilson was too, his second wife.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions, did Northern Blacks stick with the Republican Taft in 1912, or did some of them go with Teddy Roosevelt and the Bulmus candidate?
It's a great question. So from what we can tell, and it's always a little bit difficult without sort of the modern exit polling, it does seem that most African Americans stuck with Taft because of the connection to the Republican Party, but also because Roosevelt embraced a lily white republicanism in the South in an effort to compete across the sort of political map with Wilson.
And that was more because of the Republican association with Lincoln. In other words, them voting in ways that they believed were in their self-interest, as
Absolutely.
opposed to the vision of the Democratic Party.
If the Republican Party went down, then that world of political connection between a government that to some extent includes Black people, that could go down, right? There was a real fear that the federal government would lose all connection with Black people if the Republican Party was not in power.
Do you think that Wilson was typical of the white progressives of his period, that he was excluding Black people from his vision of fair and democratic society?
Of white progressives, sure. I think progressivism is a really broad category that includes lots of people, including Ida B. Wells and W.B. Du Bois and Mary Church Terrell, who were African-American progressives who thought that the government as a whole could help the human species progress and make the life better tomorrow. That was a progressive vision that was shared across the color line, across lots of different activists and thinkers. But white progressives certainly had, Wilson was typical in the sense of what the scholar William Link has called a progressivism for whites only, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And I also think that you know, there is a difference between how African Americans view this idea of the people in democracy,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to this kind of limited construct that says only some people deserve the freedoms that our society grants. And so that difference is what I think has made our democracy so much broader, not merely representative, but actually willing to include. And this is what we litigate. We go back and forth, trying to determine whether we really are committed to a democracy that allows everyone to come in, or whether we want to restrict rights to ensure that certain bases are given power and others are not.
And for somebody like Du Bois, it wasn't just a question of when you wrote out certain people from democracy, they were left out. You also left out a capacity to see yourself, right? Du Bois argued that those who were excluded, those who were marginalized, were actually more capable of seeing society as a whole. Right? In Souls of Black Post, he calls this gifted with second sight, that African Americans actually saw white America better than white America saw itself. And then when you disenfranchise, when you leave out African Americans, you leave out that self-critical, the capacity to be self-critical, to really see what you're doing, what the consequences are of what you're doing, who you're excluding, who you're including. So that not only do we sort of stand with the concept of one person, one vote, but also when you include more kinds of people, you are able to see yourself better, see what the society is made of better.
Well, let me just add one more thing, and that is why I think protest movements, especially in this country, are critical. They are stridently critical because of exclusion. If we allow people to engage, to develop, to have a say in our democracy, we would be debating these issues. But what happens is we exclude people, push them to the perimeter, and then in order to be heard, it requires a much more strident voice.
Yeah.
So.
When you talk about not being able to see yourself, or it's easier to see the others, do you think that Wilson was able to there was a moment of self-reflection and he was able to see himself in the decisions that he made and the choices that he was making in terms of democracy?
Yeah, you know, he was certainly private, and you know, those who have written biographies of him have acknowledged that he's a tough guy to get inside, right? John Milton Cooper, who's sort of the leading biographer, will acknowledge it's a little tough to get inside. I always go back to this crucial moment in which Wilson met William Monroe Trotter in his office. And Trotter was absolutely brilliant and beautifully made the case, right, for why segregation and exclusion of African Americans created an incompleteness, right? Created a hole in Wilson's vision of democracy and of the United States, and laid it out quite clearly and quite personally. He talked about the pain, the trauma of being excluded from a country in which you are supposed to be a citizen. And Wilson could not process it, right? The transcript shows that Wilson got angry, saw Trotter as troublesome, right? What Lewis would have called good trouble, right?
Absolutely.
That Trotter was not really listening. The problem was with Trotter, right? Not with Wilson's vision. That's very clear in that encounter. And so it's difficult for me to find any evidence that Wilson really understood that his the sort of incompleteness in his vision.
Do you think that in 1908 he had that vision about women and that they should be inside the home? They didn't have the ability to have the right to vote because they didn't have the experience. They didn't have this experience of being outside the home. His evolution by 1918, addressing Congress, addressing the gentlemen of the Senate, and saying, these women have been our partners. They've had this opportunity in World War I, and we should enfranchise them because of their partnership. We rely on them. Do you think if we had fast forwarded with Trotter and put Trotter in, that evolution took 10 years for Wilson. Do you think if we put Trotter in his office in 1919 and 1920, that conversation would be different? There would have been an evolution.
So it's certainly not in 1919, 1920, because we know that Wilson carried that vision into the war, that African Americans were not given the opportunity to serve. They mobilized and they volunteered to serve in disproportionate numbers, and yet they were not lauded, they were not celebrated. Black soldiers in World War I were not given the opportunity. So that was a clear moment, 1920, right? A moment in which African Americans could be celebrated for their contributions, and they absolutely were not. Du Bois, you know, screamed himself hoarse trying to get someone to acknowledge the service, the contributions of African Americans to the World War I effort, and no one within the Wilson administration took that up. So it's hard to say that in 1920.
We are just at 1 o'clock. So if we can, Brenda, do you have one other comment you'd like to wrap up with?
Yeah, I just wondered from Eric what the difference was in Wilson. Why was he able to capitulate as it relates to women's suffrage, but so unable to even acknowledge the contributions of African Americans in a world war?
So one of the arguments that the scholar Victoria Bristol Brown has made, which I find really fascinating, is that it was Wilson's daughters and suffrage activists who were able to convince Wilson that women could become enfranchised voters, that they could become political in that way without losing their essential nature as women, right? So for what his daughter said to him was, we're still your daughters, right? We're still women even if we vote. And that was crucial, she argues, to Wilson's sort of turnabout and saying, okay, so people can be who they need to be for our society and still be political. There's no evidence that he was able to make a similar argument for Black citizens, right? For Black Americans, that they would both be equal enfranchised citizens and remain what they were needed to be, which is essentially subservient, right?
Well, the other issue that this makes is the issue of proximity, which we found in politics is such a profound persuasive element. When people are proximal to each other, they understand the humanity of each other. They engage with each other. Then they begin to see some of these issues that you can be comfortable having at a distance very differently.
Great point. Yeah.
I need to wrap it up and say thank you to both of you, and thank you to our audience for the fantastic questions. I appreciate your engagement today and very interesting, deep conversation. It's been recorded. We will edit it for just some of the little glitches, and it will be posted on our site. Thank you very much. In 2 weeks, we will have the next conversation. It will be about race in the Department of State at the United States. We will have Ambassador Joel Daines, Chris Richardson from State Department, retired State Department, as well as Professor Wharton moderating the conversation. So I encourage you to tune in on October 20th at noon, and we will have that conversation then. Thank you again, Professor Yellin and Brenda Jones. I appreciate it, and we'll see everyone soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.